Take yourself back to the earliest days of 2020. It is the new year, and you've been celebrating the end of 2019, and you're hopeful for a fresh start. But if you watch the news, you'll remember it was a particularly tough year for the Australian bushfires. The United Kingdom was wrestling with the implications of Brexit, and in the United States of America, Pier 1 Imports had just announced its closing of hundreds of stores, a blow to the decorative charger industry and the middle class as a whole. But in the midst of this chaos, one speedrunner decided to try their hand at the 1998 classic Nintendo 64 game, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Their name was Lozoots, and this run would become infamous for kicking off the game's any percent category. Before we continue with Lozoots' groundbreaking speedrun, I want to talk about my own experience with the game. Ocarina of Time was one of the first games I remember watching commercials for on TV and asking my parents to get me for Christmas. I had a Nintendo Entertainment System and video games before that, sure, but I was oblivious to how those games came into my life. Ocarina was different. This was an event, and when I got my hands on the game, I spent hours upon hours with it. Hundreds of hours. My relationship with Ocarina of Time is the kind that underscores just how amazing video games can be. Beating the game after 100 hours felt significant at the time. In 1998, I wouldn't have imagined beating the game in under an hour. I wouldn't have considered it. So when I saw what speedrunners would come to do to the game, I had a deep sense of awe. This brings us back to the stressful days of early 2020. Not only did Lozoots speedrun Ocarina of Time, but they got the very first any percent world record. Now, we know this is the first speedrun of the game at all, because if there were any other runs of any kind, then those would have been recorded as any percent category world records. Imagine that. The very first speedrun of Ocarina of Time didn't even happen until the eve of the COVID-19 pandemic. For anyone who's new to speedrunning, it is a bit shocking that the first speedrun of Ocarina of Time wasn't completed until 2020. Ocarina of Time was an incredibly popular game at the time of its release, and it has continued to enjoy popularity in its decline from modern to retro. At the same time, speedrunning was in no way a new phenomenon in 2020. For example, the blockbuster speedrunning event Games Done Quick had already gained a great deal of notoriety. For such a popular game to exist at the same time as this hobby is frankly bizarre. Now, unless you're very new to speedrunning, you're probably asking yourself what I could possibly be talking about. People had been speedrunning Ocarina of Time for over a decade before 2020, and Lozoots' run in January of that year was nowhere near the first any percent world record. Now, why would I make a video where I made up a story about how the first Ocarina of Time speedrun was in 2020? The answer is that I didn't make it up. The speedrun.com page for the Ocarina of Time lists the first any percent speedrun as January 15, 2020. That's weird, right? If you're at all curious about why that speedrun leaderboard is missing so much of its history, then grab some popcorn because we're talking about everything and anything any percent. I promise that we will get back to Ocarina of Time, but for a moment, we need to take a slight detour. A key question I want you to think about as we go is this: how do we define any percent? Now, I'm going to make the case that the way we think about any percent is a mess, and we should try and fix it a bit. I also think that by examining the concept of any percent, we can identify interesting questions about the state of speedrunning in general. Depending on how we approach these questions, we might consider them to be philosophical or social. We might just consider them simply administrative. Some of these questions are already subject to extensive discussion and debate in the world of speedrunning. There are a few reasons that I have for making this video. At surface level, there are some things about speedrun leaderboards and categories that simply annoy me, and this is my way to voice my displeasure to the universe. Beyond that, though, I think that the way we think about any percent allows us to reflect on how we view our hobby more generally. If you think any particular idea in this video is interesting, please take a moment to leave a comment about it. Please also take the time to subscribe to my channel and hit the notification button so that you know when future videos are posted. Before we dive in, I want to provide a little bit of disclosure. I can't eliminate my own bias from what I write, but I can do my best to tell you where I think I might be emotionally involved in the subject, and I can encourage you to look further if something I say doesn't seem correct. Now, first of all, I am a speedrunner myself. I've been a mod for speed games on speedrun.com, and I have preferences for how we use the term any percent and how I see our hobby evolving. There are times in this video that I will speak about my own experiences in speedrunning. I do this because sharing personal experiences can make for a more compelling story, not to suggest that my personal experience is normal or universal. I've tried to arrange this video working from general concepts to more specific concepts, so that we can have a common understanding of big ideas before we apply them to very narrow, specific examples. Despite using this approach as a way to make sure that we understand each other, I still have made several assumptions. I've assumed that you, the viewer, are familiar with video games and speedrunning. I've also assumed that you have a robust command of the English language. Let's begin with some of those very general concepts. It's important that we talk a little about how we define any percent, given that it is our focus here. So I'm going to start off with some elementary things first, so that we're all on the same page. A speedrun is an attempt to complete an objective in a game as quickly as possible. We do this with many objectives, including simply completing a game. The first speedrunners just did it alone. No recordings, no splits, no leaderboard. When they first shared their times, it was in an online forum, and it was for enthusiasts. Now, many people stream and record speedruns and share them with others. Some of us post these recordings to leaderboards to compare our times, but none of this is required. A speedrunner is someone who simply engages in the act of speedrunning. Even if you do it alone in your basement, just you and your system, no splits, no recordings, no world records, no Twitch viewers, you're still a speedrunner. The simple act of speedrunning is not necessarily a social exercise. However, the wider hobby of speedrunning includes a vast network of supporters, enthusiasts, organizations, charities, and companies. Any speedrunner that takes the added step of streaming on Twitch or posting their times to a speedrun leaderboard is contributing to that broader social phenomena. Depending on the speedrun objective and how it is achieved, we separate speedruns of a particular game into categories. Humans often categorize things. It's important to the way we think about the world. Researchers from Ohio State University put it this way: the ability to form categories or equivalence classes of discriminable entities is a central component of human cognition. Categorization enables abstract thought and promotes expansion of knowledge to novel situations. We categorize things in our own mind to help us process the information we take in, and we also categorize things socially to help build a complex understanding of the universe around us. By creating speedrun categories, we come to a common understanding by establishing mutually understood definitions for what is included and excluded. Speedrun categories allow us to compare things in order to rank performances. The categories are an extension of our social relationships within the hobby. You can do any speedrun with any rules on your own, but for it to exist as a category within a community, you need to have buy-in from others. The specific categories that exist for a game are a construct of the community around that game, although there are a few concepts that most communities share. A few common categories include 100%, in which a speedrunner completes the game to its fullest, and glitchless, in which the speedrunner completes the game without clips, zips, and other types of exploits. Sometimes moderators of a game's speedrun.com leaderboard set up categories for games before there is an interest in that category. But the vast majority of speedrun categories, especially the populated categories, are the product of popular demand. The categories exist because one or more people find that way to play the game fun or interesting and want a place to share their times. Any percent is a category of speedrun in which a game's ending is reached regardless of the portion of the game's content that is experienced or employed. The meaning is in the name. Any percentage of the game. If a game can be beaten, it has an any percent category built into it. If you can ask yourself, what is the fastest way to get from the beginning of this game to the end, and there is an answer to that question, then you can have an any percent in the game. Now it's important to highlight something here. By this definition of any percent, every speedrun that completes a game is also an any percent speedrun. For example, if you complete 100% of the game for a 100% speedrun, you've also satisfied all the requirements of an any percent speedrun. One ramification of this is that if you've completed a full game speedrun of any kind, then you have completed an any percent speedrun. Therefore, the history of any percent speedrun records for any video game should be a history of all of the fastest times that that game has been completed in, regardless of what other categories those speedruns fall into. If we go back to our story about Ocarina of Time, this is why it is so strange that the first any % speedrun is recorded in 2020. If there was any speedrun in any category that finished the game before 2020, regardless of what type of run it was, it would still be an any % speedrun. So what happened with the Ocarina of Time any % leaderboard? We will come back to this again a little later. Now that we've talked about how we define any %, we need to talk about how we define any %. We can discuss generalizations of any % all day, but the way that this type of category is actually implemented varies widely. The real existing categories even undermine the definition that I went over before. In linguistics, there is an important concept called usage. Usage refers to the real-life, day-to-day ways that speakers employ words, grammar, and all the things that linguists usually go on about. This contrasts with the official or theoretical rules of a language. As a community, speedrunning has its own organically evolving terminology, and usage varies widely for several key terms. At first, there were just speed runs. We didn't even have a common agreement between speedrun, speedrun with a hyphen, or just a single word speedrun in the early days. The speedrun race website Speedruns Live gives a subtle indication of this in the way its logo capitalizes the word run. At this point, the speedrun world has largely settled on this single word speedrun, without a hyphen, without a space. Any % is no different. Any % can mean a few different things to a few different folks, depending on how the game is being run. For some games, like Ninja Gaiden for the Nintendo Entertainment System and Celeste on PC, it is simply used to describe runs that are a straight shot for the end of the game. But other games have several extended contexts for the term to be utilized. Some speedrun communities avoid using the term any % altogether. Super Mario 64 has categories that reflect the number of stars that the player is required to collect before finishing the game. 120 star, 70 star, 16 star, 1 star, and even 0 star. Nowhere does any % make an appearance. The term any % has evolved to meet the usage needs of different speed game communities in different ways. Most games only have a single any % category. If we strictly follow the definition I provided before, then there wouldn't be room for more than one. However, there are a good number of games that have more than one any % category. Not only do they exist, but they generally apply the term any % in similar ways. For example, any % speedruns for the 2023 PC game Pizza Tower are separated into two leaderboards. There is an any % unrestricted category, which would be the any % we defined earlier. There is also a separate board under any % with the qualification no major glitches. Pizza Tower speedrunners are using any % here slightly differently than the definition I set out before. Here, Pizza Tower speedrunners are saying you can beat the game however you want, with this one caveat. Another similar example is the 2017 game Hollow Knight. Any % is similarly divided, this time into 4 different leaderboards. These include no major glitches again, also no main menu storage, all glitches, and 1.4, 0.3, 0.2 plus no major glitches. Game version differences can also play a key role in how leaderboards are sorted. A good example of this is the leaderboard for Minecraft being split into different distinct versions, with their own subcategories underneath those umbrellas. Minecraft is a pretty good example of the abuse of the concept of any %. In the Bedrock Edition alone, there are 4 categories of any % that each have no fewer than 4 subcategories. Honestly, determining which version and which subcategory was the fastest of them all at a given time would require cross-referencing a great deal of information. In the cases of Minecraft, Pizza Tower, and Hollow Knight, the speedrunning communities are classifying both glitched runs and glitchless runs as any % categories. Here, any % just means that the goal is to beat the game as fast as possible, but there is an underlying disagreement about what it means to beat the game. If you use a glitch, especially a glitch that seriously changes the speedrun and cuts out part of the game, did you still beat the game? There are speedrunners who run glitched and glitchless categories of games that separate any % in this way. This is not a distinction which is necessarily a deep conviction for runners of the game, but it is serious enough that there are separate leaderboards. The difference between having an any percent category and a separate no major glitches category, or having an any percent glitched and an any percent no major glitches category might be slight, but exploring the subtlety is what ponderous YouTube videos are for. I think that this glitched versus glitches concept that separates some any percent categories is interesting because it reflects a larger underlying question in speedrunning that has existed since the hobby began. It is important that I note here that any time any percent shows up with a qualifier of any kind, you can drop the any percent from the name and it still means exactly the same thing. Here are some examples. Any percent glitchless could just be glitchless and it means the same thing. Any percent co-op could just be co-op. When we do it with difficulty settings, it is the same. Any percent easy and any percent hard could just be an easy category and a hard category, and they would mean the same thing. Any percent would just be whatever is fastest, regardless of the difficulty you played the game on. Now, if you're like me, you may think to yourself, wow, it's weird that we do it this way, we should change it. But before you go off and start having conversations about this with people in your speedrun community, I think it would be helpful for us to understand the historical reasons that we divide categories like this, and why we call them all any percent. This didn't just happen by accident, but it wasn't necessarily the result of planning either. There have always been those whose favorite speedruns to watch or perform are runs that could be described as a normal playthrough of a video game with great execution. This means that there's nothing that really breaks the game, just really good gameplay. Ninja Gaiden for the NES is a good example of a game that everyone agrees is pretty hard, but speedrunners are able to master. There is no part of the best performing Ninja Gaiden any percent speedruns that would make a watcher question if the player had beaten the game. All runs beat all the bosses. There are no significant glitches or changes made by the player to the game. And the tricks that speedrunners use could be found and were often known by casual players before speedrunning was really a thing. However, this is not always the case for all speedruns. The Mega Man series of games is a popular example of games that have glitches and other tricks that would fall outside of what we could call casual play. Mega Man 2 has a North American version and a Japanese version. There are 2 difficulty settings in the North American version and 1 difficulty setting in Japan. There are also glitches called zips, by which the player can get pushed through walls in ways that were not intended by the game's creators. Guess how many any percent categories Mega Man 2 has? 1? Of course not. 2? Nah. Try 6. 6 any percent categories. Speedruns that include glitches can be controversial because some people don't believe they represent an honest completion of the game. This is usually not a hotly debated topic these days, but in the past it was a part of a nexus of events that led us to using the term any percent in such strange ways. In extreme cases, a speedrun that includes glitches can shorten an hours-long adventure game to a brief series of inputs. Take Super Mario World for the Super Nintendo as an example. The box art for the game says that Mario's off on his biggest adventure ever, and says that the player will discover more warps and thrilling bonus worlds than ever before. For its time, Super Mario World was a pretty expansive world that players were able to get lost in and spend hundreds of hours exploring. For someone whose expectations of Super Mario World are that it is an expansive game, the 41-second zero-exit speedrun could understandably be very jarring. These hyper-short speedruns are a result of unintended interactions in the game's code that most players would be totally unfamiliar with before speedrunning existed. It is not surprising that some players, even other speedrunners, don't consider this to be reflective of actually having beat the game. The fact that so many glitches are discovered by tool-assisted speedrunners probably doesn't help them with purists who are already dubious. Tool-assisted speedruns use emulators to make a movie with frame-by-frame inputs into the game. This is impossible for humans to replicate. Let's go back to Mega Man just for a moment. Speedrun documentarian Summoning Salt has a YouTube video out called The History of Mega Man 2 World Records, which I invite you to check out if you want to know more about that topic specifically. In that video, Summoning Salt mentions how Japanese speedrunners of the mid-2000s used rapid fire or turbo, which was normal for speedrunners there, but disallowed by the rules established in North America. If you're not familiar, a lot of early video game consoles had controllers, either that came with a system or could be purchased later, with a function that allowed you to hold a button down, and the system would read it as a button press on every frame. This is not possible on most controllers without the assistance of the turbo setting. Turbo was an important early question for speedrunning. If a human can't hit the button every frame, should we allow the use of a tool that would let us do that? Some consoles, like the TurboGrafx 16, were sold with turbo controllers out of the box, and speedruns of games for that system, like the wonderful Bonk's Adventure, do allow it. However, most other systems where turbo was not normally a part of the system do not allow it. If turbo doesn't sound that intrusive to you, think about other third-party tools that have been available and how they might affect speedruns. The legendary Game Genie tool physically docked between the Nintendo Entertainment System and its cartridges to adjust the code as it was communicated between the two. Both the Game Genie and Turbo Controller offer an advantage that a speedrunner can purchase. The vast majority of speedrun communities would not allow this type of advantage, not because it doesn't mean that the game isn't being beaten, but because it undermines that the game is being beaten by the player. When taken to its most extreme extent, this trend leads us to tool-assisted speedruns, which are a valuable part of the speedrunning ecosystem. These types of runs embrace things like emulators to play a game out in a way that is perfect. These are not included in any percent because it is commonly accepted that this falls outside the concept of a human player beating the game. I want to highlight a specific example of the debate around turbo because I think it underscores how these questions are neither black nor white. In 2022, the speedrunning community for the 2021 Nintendo Switch game Metroid Dread changed its rules to allow turbo controls. Every leaderboard for the game includes an indicator showing if turbo was used in the run or not, but all the runs are listed together. The Metroid Dread folks did this for an interesting reason. In a Kotaku article about the rule change, the runners are very clear why they think it is a good idea: accessibility. Button mashing is not an ergonomic exercise and can lead to long-term wrist and other issues, and the game's default control scheme is especially hard on the hands. Metroid Dread speedrunners decided that turbo makes their speedruns more accessible to runners that want or need that option, so they allow it on their leaderboards. Emulators are another interesting aspect of this discussion. There has always been a segment of the speedrunning community who are either openly opposed to, or at least skeptical of, speedruns that employ an emulator. If you're out of the loop, an emulator is just alternative software to run your video game. One example of the benefit of an emulator is that it makes it possible to run a Nintendo Entertainment System game on your PC. Emulators are often the only way that some speedrunners are going to be able to play a lot of the older games that are no longer available for purchase. While there are accessibility benefits, for example the ability to use a more comfortable controller that is incompatible with the original console, most of the time there is no actual speed advantage provided through emulation. Generally, the speedrunning world has settled on a compromise position, where most speedrun boards include an indicator that notes if an emulator was used, but it has no bearing on the standing. Now, we have veered into thinking a lot about third-party tools like controllers and emulators, but what about tools that are supplied by the game's makers? I mostly speedrun games from the 1990s, which means games that originally came on a compact disc or a cartridge. You typically went to a brick and mortar store in a local strip mall and purchased a small cardboard box that included your video game, a small pamphlet of horribly incomplete game information, and, if you were really lucky, a poster. That was it. Some PC games got expansion packs, which were sometimes as significant in terms of content as the original game. You could buy things like third-party controllers, but compared to today, the ability to augment your gameplay was limited to what was available at the mall. There was also little incentive to purchase tools that would help speedrun games because speedrunning didn't really exist. The modern video game world is very different from what I've just described. The industry has found many new ways to part gamers with their money: endless downloadable content, games as a service, skins, and more. I don't feel the need to go into a great level of detail because none of this is a secret, and even if you've never read a paragraph of news about the gaming industry, you've probably come across some method of a game studio trying to siphon a cash from your wallet that you didn't agree with. You can think what you want about video game monetization. That's not the focus of this video. However, one specific aspect of monetization that does collide with the topic at hand is pay to win. This is the subset of modern video game monetization that gives the player in-game power or advantage by paying real-life money. For some games, pay-to-win exists on the periphery of play, such as the ability to purchase inventory space in Path of Exile. For other games, it is a core feature, like the ability to purchase your way to the top in Diablo Immortal. Let's return to the Legend of Zelda series for a moment. If you take a look at any percent speedruns of the 2017 Wii U title Breath of the Wild, you'll notice an interesting indicator on the leaderboard: Amiibo. Amiibos are small figurines of Nintendo video game characters that can be used to interact with games by sending a signal to the device. This is a type of video game peripheral that is called toy-to-life, though I had never heard that term before researching this video. Nintendo seems to be the only major gaming company that uses toys to life in an enduring way. You can also buy Amiibo cards that you can tap on your Nintendo console rather than carrying around the figurines. Breath of the Wild is a popular game for speedrunners. There are 9 pages of forum posts on the speedrun.com page for the game. Most of these threads only have a small handful of replies. There are 2 posts with over 100 replies. One is about creating categories in general. The title of the other post? Amiibo. The use of this pay-to-win peripheral in any percent and other categories was a controversial subject for the Breath of the Wild community. Some speedrunners wanted Amiibo excluded from any percent. The concept of multiple any percent categories, as we saw it used in other games, was also raised in the discussion. Now, should a 4-inch plastic toy that drops weapons and armor on Link when you tap them on your Wii U be allowed in speedruns? To put it another way, are Amiibos part of the game? I think it's a fair question. I'm not a Breath of the Wild speedrunner, and unless you are, it isn't up to us. Breath of the Wild speedrunners decided to include Amiibo in the N% category. Let's go back to the example from the beginning of the video, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Before 2020, there was certainly an N% category. If you go back with archive.org's Wayback Machine to July 2017, you can see an N% leaderboard with hundreds of speedruns posted to it. Then why, for the love of all that is holy, does it currently say that the first N% speedrun was in 2020? The reason for this is that when new tricks were discovered or first implemented in Ocarina of Time's N% speedruns, in the case of Lozut's run, it was stale reference manipulation, there was a call from some speedrunners to split the category. In speedrunning, splitting the category means dividing one leaderboard into 2 or more leaderboards. This is not uncommon, and it can be done for a few reasons. Sometimes there are irreconcilable elements between 2 versions of a video game. For example, Tetris for the Nintendo Entertainment System and Tetris for the Game Boy. Not only are the categories between the games split, but they're entirely different pages on speedrun.com. Another reason that categories get split is as a result of changes to a speedrun. When a new approach is implemented for a game that significantly changes the speedrun, some of the people who ran the game using the older method can request or argue for the continuation of the old route as a new category. When these new strategies push down the N% time, as happened with Ocarina of Time, there are going to be some people who say that they like the way that the game was speedrun before the change. An article published on speedrun.com itself even said that many N% runners for Ocarina of Time did not enjoy the new route. In the Ocarina of Time speedrunning world, there are several categories that are each impressive in their own way. Some categories require that the runner clear every dungeon, some have a rule that they have to clear the last boss Ganon, and the N% category currently just warps from Kokiri Forest to the ending credits. It isn't a surprise to me that some speedrunners would want to continue their old N% route as a new category. However, instead of keeping the N% category intact and creating a second category with a different set of rules, the Ocarina of Time mods did something else. They changed the name of the old N% category, or moved all of the N% speedruns to a different category, then they created a new category that they called N%. There are 2 major issues with this approach. This approach has the result of erasing the history of the N% category and making it look like Lozut's run was the first. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, it's completely fine for a speedrun to satisfy the requirements of both an N% speedrun and the requirements of a different category. If a new category was created, the speedrunners who had their runs already on the N% leaderboard could simply cross-post their runs to the new category. This would ensure that both categories are recorded more accurately and give agency to speedrunners to decide if they want to consider their N% speedrun to also be a run of the other category. Another issue with this approach is that it undermines the achievement of the runner who posted the new time. Lozut's was running against other speedrun times. Their world record speedrun was impressive because there was an existing community of speedrunners that they bested. By stripping the category of its history, the accomplishment of the speedrun is diminished in the historical record. I want to be clear that I'm not trying to pick on the mods or the community for Ocarina of Time. The reason that I think this video is worth making is that there are many other games for which determining the history of their fastest speedruns can be difficult for similar reasons. On the speedrun.com page for The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, there are earlier 100% speedruns of the game listed than any of the earliest 3 separate categories of any percent. The speedrun.com page for Super Mario Bros. 3 divides any percent into 3 separate categories, and the earlier records from any percent Warpless are not reflected in the any percent category. The exact same problem exists in the leaderboard history of any percent for Pokemon Red and Blue, because earlier any percent runs are recorded as any percent glitchless. There are earlier all stages speedruns of Donkey Kong Country listed than the earliest any percent run. For all of these games, and many that I haven't listed, there are clearly holes in the any percent history as a result of the way that the leaderboards have been administered over time, but the problem goes even further. The leaderboards for many games, like Super Mario 64 and Super Mario World, don't even include an any percent category, making it all the more difficult to understand the progression of speedrun history for those games. That isn't because there hasn't been a progression of the time for what would be any percent. The information is obscured by the community's decision not to record their times as any percent times. I could go on about speedrun leaderboards that don't accurately reflect the history of any percent for hours and hours. The point I'm trying to get at is this. There is a curious phenomena that happens to any percent as time goes on. Across speed games, not just in different games, but for different systems and at different times, leaderboard mods repeatedly recategorize speedruns out of the any percent category. I would argue that this undermines the historical record for those games. I also think it undermines the accomplishment of those great advances in the any percent category because they're erased from a written record. Some people might say that I'm making something out of nothing and that this doesn't really matter. To those people, I would say that speedrun.com is designed to show the history of speedrun world records. There are incredibly popular YouTube channels dedicated to researching speedrun history. There is a demonstrated interest in keeping this history because it's important to the community. Think about it this way. The title of this video is only kind of clickbaity because you probably already know Ocarina of Time speedruns started before 2020, and you wanted to know how someone could get that so wrong. If this was just a one-off administrative problem on a handful of speedrun leaderboards, that would be one thing, but that is not how I interpret it. We have to decide what any percent means. Does any percent just mean beat the game and can be qualified to construct various categories? Or does any percent mean beat the game without qualification? This isn't an optional part of the hobby. If we keep any percent leaderboards the way that they are, we are accepting one answer. If you think it is worthwhile to join a speedrunning community and post your times to a leaderboard, then I would assume that you care about the leaderboard system following a coherent set of rules and definitions. I would also assume that you care about the history of your speed game. If you do, all I'm suggesting is that you consider the things I've said about any percent because it comes from a place of care for the history of speedrunning. We've gone over some controversies and discussions about what any percent means in the context of various speed games. For me, there is a natural next step to move on from the questions we have about what fits in any percent and how we conceptualize speedruns to the processes we have to implement decisions. I think there's also a lot of open questions about how decisions are made in and about speedrunning and the direction of the hobby in a broader sense. These questions go far beyond the scope of this video, but I would enjoy writing about them in the future. We're at the end of my story for this video. I set out to show you that the way we think and talk about any percent is a bit of a mess. If you agree or disagree with anything I've said in this video, please let me know constructively in the comments. There's so many other questions I have about the philosophy, history, and social dynamics of speedrunning, but I couldn't cover all of that in this video. If you found this video interesting, please let me know, because the feedback I get about this video is going to inform how I approach making future videos. I look forward to hearing from others who have ideas to share about speedrunning and any percent in particular. I'll catch you next time. Thank you for watching.